County Public Library's Meet the Author series. Tonight we host author Sam Quinones in conversation with CNN correspondent Nick Valencia. My name is Denise Ozier, and I'm the Community Partnership and Adult Programming Manager for the Gwinnett County Public Library System. Tonight's moderator is Nick Valencia, a CNN correspondent based in the network's global headquarters in Atlanta. He regularly appears on CNN, CNN International, HLN, and CNN en Espanol. Valencia won an Atlanta Press Club Award for his reporting along the US-Mexico border, where he spent 7 weeks living in El Paso, Texas. He was CNN's lead reporter covering President Trump's zero-tolerance family separation policy that was later lifted. Valencia has been dedicated much of his attention in recent years to covering issues that impact the Latino community. He has been nominated for an Emmy and has been part of the news coverage, earning 3 Peabody Awards at CNN. He was twice nominated by the Atlanta Press Club as Broadcast TV Reporter of the Year, and he currently lives in Atlanta and serves as the National Vice President of Broadcast for NAHJ. Tonight's author, Sam Quinones, is a journalist, storyteller, former LA reporter, and the author of 3 acclaimed books of narrative nonfiction. His career as a journalist has spanned almost 30 years. He has worked for National Geographic, Pacific Standard Magazine, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Magazine, and many others. Columbia Journalism School elected him as the 2008 recipient of the Maria Corres Cabot Prize for excellence in covering Latin America. He is also the recipient of the Alicia Patterson Fellowship and one of the most prestigious fellowships given to print journalists. His new book is The Least of Us: Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. I give you Sam and Nick.
Thank you so much, Denise. We're so grateful for this discussion. As mentioned, I'm Nick Valencia with CNN national correspondent, and I'm so grateful to have been asked to moderate this discussion with Sam Quinones. I'll share a quick story. You know, I'm married to a woman who's very unimpressed by what I do, but when I said I was going to talk to Sam, she said, "Oh, I know him." So this is an exciting thing here for Casa Valencia here, the Valencia household, to be part of this. Sam, I'm so grateful. We both have an LA connection. We're both, you know, you're close by. I grew up in Eagle Rock, Northeast LA. You're right around the corner from us.
In Pasadena, so, that's right.
It's so nice. It's so nice to see you here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much for doing this, Nick. I really appreciate your interest, and it's great to be on this with you.
Well, I want to start by just sort of broadly here by us talking about your career. If you could just give us a little bit about, you know, how you got involved and interested in this beat that you're covering.
Well, basically, I've been a reporter for quite a long time, and my first job was as a crime reporter in Stockton, California, which was fantastic training. Sadly, it's a great town. It's got a lot of issues with crime, but for a crime reporter, it's a wonderful place to learn the job, and that kind of led me. Long story short, and I spent then. After that, 10 years living in Mexico, living and working as a freelance writer in Mexico, came back in 2004 to take a job at the LA Times, kind of always my hometown paper, so to speak. And it was there that I began to cover the drug war that began to kick off about a year or 2 after I left Mexico. Nothing like it had ever happened when I was in Mexico. It was a very peaceful place, easy to get around, and you know, but it just got kind of crazy. So I began to cover that, and along the way I began to cover a story that I thought was very interesting, that Mexican heroin traffickers were all of a sudden seeing an enormous boom in their business. And I could not for the life of me understand how that could be. Why would anybody go back to using heroin again, you know? And I got into it. I wrote about a village in a town in the state of Nayarit in Mexico, where everybody sells heroin in the United States like pizza, basically a pizza delivery service, but for black tar heroin. But along the way, I began to realize, the reason they have such a market now, the big market, is because of this medicine, this revolution in American medicine that involves opioid painkillers, that we now need to make much greater use of these, and that they won't addict people if those people are pain patients. None of this was based really on science so much as commerce. And it basically created an enormous helped a lot of people, but also created an enormous new population of opioid addicted patients all across the country. And this created eventually those folks, some of those folks anyway, switched to heroin. And that's what got me into this whole thing. I really wanted to write about Mexican heroin traffickers. I knew nothing about the opioid epidemic because I lived in Mexico when all that was going on. It was real. I really didn't know what a Vicodin was, or what an OxyContin was, any of that stuff. And it just kind of became my beat, and that led to the first book that I wrote about this topic, Dreamland. And from there now to this one, The Least of Us.
Yeah, this is a fascinating look, and I feel like it's a primary source perspective of what's happening. And as you write in your book, Americans have really been caught off guard by this new synthetic move towards synthetic drugs. And I want you to expand on that and sort of take our audience through the evolution of just how we've gotten to this epidemic within a larger epidemic.
Well, basically, the drug trafficking world down in Mexico began to supply when the thing began to evolve into a heroin problem. The folks down in Mexico, the trafficking world down there, began to supply the heroin that people were all of a sudden finding they needed. As they did this down in Mexico, they discovered fentanyl, which is a drug they never knew about. I tell the story in the book, in The Least of Us, of a underground chemist who worked for a Mexican guy, but had lived most of his life in San Diego, and learned to make fentanyl, gone to prison for that, got out, was deported, and was contacted by the Sinaloa drug cartel to set up a lab, what they would pay for, and that they wanted him to make a chemical called ephedrine, which is what you use to make one way of making methamphetamine. He didn't want to. He thought he was smarter than they were. He thought they didn't know what they were doing. And so he begins to make fentanyl. They hear about this and they get kind of mad. They say, what's going on here? And he says, you don't understand. This is one of the great new drugs. This is more profitable than anything you've ever seen. And so he explains the profitability. This fentanyl is a wonderful medical drug. I had a heart attack in Atlanta 4 years ago. They gave me fentanyl when that happened. It's magnificent. It's totally revolutionized the entire world of anesthesia. But in the hands of the underworld is really a very dangerous thing because it is so potent. And they began to figure this out with that encounter with this underground chemist in 2006. The lab that he sets up begins to the fentanyl he makes there begins to go up to Chicago, Detroit, places like that, Philadelphia, and there it begins to. Frankly, it's the first mass die-off we've had due to fentanyl was in 2005, 2006, due to this lab this guy was running. And when they close it down, all those deaths stop. And so, but with that, you begin to see the Sinaloa cartel getting involved, seeing the light goes on and they see the profit in fentanyl.
Just how widespread is the production in Mexico? I know you go into it in your book, but for those who haven't read,
sure.
What about this certain part of Mexico and the western part of Mexico that makes it, such a big business?
Well, the northwestern part of Mexico, about, say, if you look on a map, about a day's drive south of Arizona, has long been, particularly the state of Sinaloa, but also the state of Durango, Michoacan as well, these states have long been the center of drug trafficking in Mexico, dating back really to, well, at least to the 60s and certainly the 70s. And all the major traffickers who have come out of Mexico have 80% of them have been from Sinaloa. And so there's a long history. That's where Chapo Guzman's from. That's where many others are from. There's a long history of drug trafficking in that area. Now, they start with marijuana. They start with opium poppies. It's plant-based drugs. But along the way, many years later, their forebears, the inheritors of all this, begin to understand that it's much better to use, to make your own drugs in a lab. No plants, with that, you don't have to worry about whether or not you get any sun or rain or irrigation or helicopters overhead because you're in a lab. You don't need to worry about anything except where you can get the chemicals, and that requires shipping ports. That's what you really need. It's no longer important to have land. It's important to have access to shipping ports, because from there you get all your access to the world chemical markets, China and all the rest, right? And that is essentially what's happened. There are 2 shipping ports along that coast, Pacific coast there, and through those ports, I should say, they are able to bring in just unrelenting container loads of chemicals, and the change has been over the last few years. It's been relatively rapid, this transformation. I'd say the last 5 years, and maybe even a lot of areas kind of last 2, where you're seeing
just speed, right? I mean, before now, we were seeing a lot of this production out of China, and
yes.
Now it's, according to your reporting, brilliant reporting, it's really shifted towards North America specifically.
Exactly right. China, the Chinese government put a lid on that, and they said no more. Only a few companies can now make fentanyl in China, and they were obeyed, as the government there is not to be trifled with, apparently. And so, but by then, this was 2019. By then, really, the Mexican trafficking world had figured out how to make fentanyl. The underground chemist alerted them to this, but he was then put in prison, and so they didn't have access to him so much, certainly not on a daily basis. And so they had to wait, but eventually they found chemists who could teach them how to do it. And now they know exactly how to do it. So all of this new supply was coming from China, but really through the mail, like pound or kilo or 2 at a time. You don't get to the kind of supply that we have in the United States through this kind of piecemeal United Postal Service kind of mailing stuff that the Chinese chemical companies figured out how to do. It's just not that's just not possible. You can't mail that quantity over. It's really only possible with a country with which we share a 2,000-mile border, with which we have free trade, and so there are millions of back and forth trips, people, cars, and especially trucks, back and forth through the border crossings, the numerous border crossings along the border. That is why we are seeing the quantities of fentanyl just surpass anything we've ever seen, and that's beginning really in about 2000, I'd say 19 or so, right after the Chinese kind of began to shut it down.
You write in an excerpt of your book that was published in The Atlantic about a DEA chemist named Joe Bazenko, who back in 2006 makes this discovery that things are changing in the meth world. And I think all of us that are interested here in your reporting, we've heard about meth, we've heard about meth users. You see these, sheriff's office post photos of mugshots and just how much faces have decayed and changed by, habitual meth users. But it's different what you're talking about. This is a shift, a really hard shift towards a synthetic type of meth. Explain a little bit more about how the game was changed and revolutionized.
Sure. The first methamphetamine you're referring to was made with the drug called ephedrine. It's a decongestant. You've probably seen it in Sudafed pills and all the rest, right? And so all of that is, excuse me, how they made meth for many years. And it was a kind of a euphoric drug, a party drug, and that kind of thing. And it was, no meth is good for you. This one took its toll on you over many years, like those posters you referred to showed. Then in 2006, Joe Bazenko, chemist at the DEA lab in Washington, near Washington, D.C., gets a sample that shows that this one sample he analyzes, it is not made with ephedrine. And he analyzes and tries to understand how it's made. And he realizes that there's this shift that they're moving to another form of making methamphetamine. And what's important about that shift is that with this method of making methamphetamine, you no longer rely on just one chemical like ephedrine. You can make it with a whole bunch of new chemicals. And if the government cracks down on one method, you could shift to another. And then you could shift to, and these are all chemicals that are very common. They're widely used in industry. They're legal. They're highly toxic. And so what it means is that you can now, what he understood to be the case was that you can now make this in quantities that are almost limitless if you have access to the world chemical markets. That's what began to happen a couple of years later. The government in Mexico cracked down on ephedrine, couldn't get it. The trafficking world was already expecting this, 2006, 7, you began to see these samples coming across of this new way of making methamphetamine. And so what you begin to see after 2008, a shift away from the ephedrine method they always had used, and they learned to make methamphetamine doing that method, to this new method. It's far more messy, but it has that one benefit of there's no one chemical it depends on anymore. And so this allows them to begin to produce the quantities of methamphetamine that we are seeing in the United States today, which is just stunning, staggering quantities of that stuff all across the country. And that it marches across, it begins in 2013 and 14, and it marches across the country, beginning in the West, into the Midwest in about 2017, onto the East Coast and up into New England about 2019. But it's also accompanied by another thing that the other ephedrine method really never had, and that is very quick and rapid onset of symptoms of schizophrenia. Very pronounced, very intense symptoms of paranoia. Everybody's out to get you. Every car that passes must be, somebody out to get you. It's really startling the amount of paranoia this generates. And then also hallucinations, bugs and monsters under the bed and all this. It's a remarkable thing. Along with that, it makes people almost impossible to be around. So a lot of people unable to control their lives, unable to be around other people, screaming at demons that no one else sees at 3 a.m, wandering around with knives, stabbing the walls, stuff like that. They very quickly lose their homes, lose their houses. And then along with, so you get this, as this meth advances across the country, you see these homeless encampments begin to form in really significant amounts, not just in areas with a very, very pronounced high cost of housing, like LA or San Francisco, but also in small towns. I just spoke with a woman in a very small town in New Mexico, where they got many homeless now, but they have no affordable housing problem. And a small town I wrote about in The Least of Us called Clarksburg, West Virginia, where again, the same thing is true. They all of a sudden they get when this meth arrives, huge numbers of homeless, and but really no affordable housing problem of any kind. It's a Rust Belt town, really. So this is the new form of meth that's kind of moving across the country, and now has really covered the country.
Strong, powerful. I mean, this is hard stuff. And to the non-addict mind, you think that this would be, like a hand to a hot stove, and people would run away from it. But it's in fact the exact opposite.
You would think that's a great question. You would think that that's the case. But it is highly addictive too. So even though you are in your own world and kind of tormented by it, you can't stay away from it. The other thing about it is, I found this fascinating talking to people, and I keep hearing this idea that as your life disintegrates very quickly, within weeks, months, you may be homeless. This meth allows you to bear homelessness, meaning it kind of divorces you from reality. You no longer think that there's anybody, you don't no longer know where you are. Frequently, your memory also seems to disintegrate. It's also pronounced kind of disintegration in the memory. You get people kind of wandering around, sometimes using meth to stay up because they're afraid of how they'll be victimized if they fall asleep. This happens to a lot of women. There are lots of reasons why people are using it. Sometimes because they're afraid of using fentanyl, so they use meth to kind of get high, but they don't want to, there's all these kind of complicated reasons why you might use it. But what is absolutely the case is that people don't flee it. They go to it in a bizarre way I think it has to do with each individual, but is nevertheless very strange to look at, to watch.
In 2009 in Temecula, you said they called it weirdo dope, and that has a lot to do with the characteristics and traits of the addicts that are getting hooked on it. Is that right?
Yes, and in fact, that was from a guy who first clued me into this thing. My original story was going to be the Mexican trafficking world has this new way of making meth, and it has covered the United States, an unprecedented achievement.
In a way we've never seen. In a way
we've never seen one source cover the entire country with an illegal drug. That's never happened until fentanyl and now meth. Then along the way, I met a guy named Eric Barrera, who was was very lucky to have met. He was ex-Marine, lives in LA. When I met him, he was 5 years sober from methamphetamine use. Leaving the Marines in 2000, he starts using meth, and for a number of years, he holds his life together using the ephedrine meth. He has a job. It's not great, but he has a job, an apartment, a girlfriend, and he's not homeless, and it's a kind of euphoric thing. He really is some issues of depression, and so this kind of lightens his load a little bit. And he uses it off and on for a good long time. And then he told me one night, we're sitting outside a pizza place in Pasadena, and he says to me, and then in 2009, the meth changed, and all of a sudden, he used it at his girlfriend's house. All of a sudden, it was like raging maniac, thinking she was hiding a man in the walls. He begins to stab the walls with a butcher knife, this kind of thing. He says, I never felt the euphoria ever again. The meth had changed permanently. I was very quickly homeless. I was very quickly thrown out of almost every place that would accept me. And I was watching porn on my phone all the time, and just alone, very much alone and by the time I met him, he had been sober, as I said, 5 years, but his job was going through as a homeless outreach coordinator and looking in these encampments, these 10 encampments. And he told me something very powerful. He said, I don't know what's causing this, but I do know this. Every time I go through these homeless encampments, I see people who absolutely remind me of me when I was in the middle of all that. It's like everywhere I go, I see people who are in the same process of mental degradation, from then on, I just followed that story. I just called people all over the country, because if the meth's everywhere, then maybe the symptoms that Eric was describing would be everywhere too. And that's exactly what I found.
And it's really sad, Sam, to see what you describe as a poisoning of the minds of Americans. And yeah. We talked prior to this conversation, and, my takeaway was, we might be losing a generation of Americans to this new type of synthetic drugs. Do you think that those who are in charge of, law enforcement or border control, do you think that they understand the gravity and just how serious of an issue it is in the States? Because I didn't until I read your book, to be honest.
No, I think so. I absolutely think they do. But, there's huge amounts of this stuff coming through. They don't have the ability to check all not even 5% or something of the trucks coming through the border. There's just too many, and there's just not enough manpower at the border. I think that and the local cops are also, kind of on their heels. I think a lot of the issues related to decriminalization and so on have been felt through this issue as well. And so the cops are like kind of stepping away from narcotics enforcement a little bit, particularly to local level, And so you see all these examples of things that taking place that kind of mute the law enforcement response. But I would say, speaking with folks recently, a couple of sources one was a homeless shelter administrator who's been doing this 30 years. And she was telling me something I'd heard from other folks, but more graphically, I think. And she was saying, the problem we find is that people are not recovering. Once they get sober, they're sober, they're not using dope, but their brains have really not rebounded to their original situation. The devastation is palpable. And she said, we used to have, I found this fascinating. She said, years ago, we used to have all our staff were essentially life coaches, training people in how to rebuild their lives, get a driver's license, resume, job, et cetera, all these housing and finding, applying for jobs and housing and all that rest. Now, though, none of that is really the case because so many of the folks that we're seeing, their brains are damaged to the point where they can't really, there's other stuff that needs to happen a long time before they can ever start to repair their lives. They can't really conceive. Their memory is shot. They can't really understand sometimes what you're doing and what you're asking them to do. The devastation, she told me, is just scary. And yes, to me, it feels like the term you use, I think it's the right way. It's a kind of as much to do with the national poisoning as it has to do with drug addiction. And I think the problem is that we've been in the middle of COVID, and rightly so. COVID has taken up all our it's a major issue, obviously, but it has shielded us from understanding the changes afoot in our drug world as that's going on.
It's interesting you brought this up, and I was going to ask about how the pandemic is it inextricably linked with the rise of what we're seeing here in the usage? I mean, how has our isolation, our depression, anxiety, all of these inklings that we have to numb through our problems, I mean, has it contributed at all? Do you think that this is exacerbated the problem?
Oh, certainly it has. I would say a couple of things about that. One is one of the tragedies of COVID was that it hit at about the same time that the Mexican trafficking world was producing such colossal supplies that really as I said earlier, they had covered the country coast to coast, really, with those two drugs. I mean, effectively doing that. That meant that anybody who was struggling with drug addiction and was alone because of the isolation, which is something you're never supposed to do as and when you're in drug rehab, is isolate. All of a sudden they're alone and tempted to relapse and maybe do relapse. The drugs that they are finding when they relapse are the most deadly, potent, mind-mangling, in the case of meth, drugs we've ever seen. And so you get this isolation, and that is on top of that, you get these drugs that are not the drugs of even 10 years ago, which were bad enough, which were certainly bad enough. It's just that the new drugs are catastrophic, and so the COVID experience really, you saw that in the record numbers of deaths that CDC reported beginning in April 2020 to April 2021, 100,000, more than 100,000 overdose deaths. First time we've ever had that in the country, and that's COVID combined with the drugs on the street.
It surprised me. You would think that the drug dealer would want to keep their client alive and well to keep coming back, but there's just so much of a supply, it seems, that just more and more people are getting hooked, and if they lose a few along the way, so be it seems.
No, I think that's right. And the other thing is there's so much of it that, particularly in the case of fentanyl has been transformed almost into what kind of the drug equivalent of salt. The way we use salt on food, we just sprinkle it on, and everything.
Wow.
Kind of. Well, fentanyl is so common, the dealers have taken to mixing it with a lot of different things. One of them is very notably is cocaine. And that's been going on for a few years now. And you would ask that question, right? It's an excellent question. Why would you want to kill off your customers? I'm sure they don't necessarily want to kill off their customers, but they're not terribly careful or care too much about it. And the other thing is that it's actually a smart business move in a weird way, in a devious kind of way, because if you have a person who's a cocaine user, that means that person's going to buy from you every so often, maybe every couple of days, maybe every weekend. Times he's going to take a vacation from cocaine and that kind of thing. If you lace that with then fentanyl, which is an opioid, very, the same kind of essential drug as heroin or morphine, with the same addictive properties and then the same withdrawal symptoms, that people will then get addicted to fentanyl. And when they do that, that means they have to buy that drug every single day, because if they don't, the dope sickness, the withdrawals will visit them in a real powerful way. And so what you're finding is it's a kind of fentanyl is kind of used as a market expansion tool, even though a few people may die. And that's what you're finding around the country. Particularly, what we're now seeing is that people who have survived their first doses of fentanyl in either first in heroin, then in cocaine, methamphetamine. Occasionally, I know it's rare, but certainly there are some cases of marijuana being tainted with it. You are going to now what you're seeing is people addicted to fentanyl and using quantities that would have killed them a year or two ago. They've just built up the body's tolerance. Soon, though, we will see no more heroin on the street. Heroin's almost worthless in that situation because heroin is not powerful enough to take away that dope sickness. Only fentanyl will do.
Wow. You mentioned about the market. I want to know just how organized is this trafficking? Is it like we've seen in the past, the smuggling of marijuana, for instance, across the border, by someone like you mentioned, El Chapo, the Sinaloa Federation, or the Juarez cartel, name the cartel. Is this cartel related, or is it more of an unregulated free market for whoever figures this new production method out?
I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. Certainly the production now is not controlled. There's just so much of it being made. All these labs are forming, and there's, drug trafficking world in Mexico is made up of lots of small groups, usually family, village groups, extended family, what have you. It's a misconception to view it as kind of like a GM of dope or something. There is some organization to it, but when it gets down to production, that doesn't exist. It's more like a gold rush. And the people who are making the money at the lower end, I think the evidence is showing, are the people who are selling the chemicals. Just like the people who made the money in the gold rush in 1849 in California were the ones selling the shovels and the tents.
Wow.
Now it's people who are getting those chemicals, and they want more people to make it because they make more money, more chemicals they sell. But there are these kind of groups, and they're all over, and new ones form and new ones get busted and people die and all that stuff. It's constant. But what you've also seen is all of this coming together at the very time when we are illegalizing marijuana. And so you have a lot of people who are coming out of one illegal trade, not looking to get back into farming, milking cows or anything like that. They're up there. They've got their eye on much higher goal. And so meth and fentanyl have become the thing that sops up a lot of those folks to begin making.
You read my mind, Sam, because my next question was, how is weed part of this equation? How has it created this?
Well, I think what's happened, marijuana was, and to some degree probably still is for some, but not nearly as what it used to be, was the great gateway drug for Mexican traffickers. That's where weed grows very easily in the sun, of course. We're talking about in the 70s and 80s, really, before cocaine. Marijuana was really the gateway drug. It was the place where the drug in which you learned your routes. It was you learned you developed capital, confidence, connections, all these different things. And after a while, you could parlay that into something bigger, and then you could get enough assets so that you can convince Colombian traffickers to front you their cocaine. If you have enough stuff, ranches, cows, trucks, etc., they'll front you it because they know you've got the stuff that they can take. This was what was going on in the 80s and the 90s when it came to cocaine. Marijuana trained a lot of people in the drug world. Chapo Guzman was a marijuana trafficker before he was anything else in this world. And so that was a big part of it. Now we're legalizing here, and a lot of those guys are finding themselves without the market that they once had. And so a lot of those folks now are shifting into fentanyl. And I think particularly methamphetamine, because these areas, there's a very, very high knowledge base of how to make methamphetamine and the chemicals and the processes and all that kind of stuff. Now it's a little bit like, my conception is it's a little bit like the Silicon Valley of meth. If you take from Michoacan all the way up to the hills of Sinaloa.
Now, these are dealers with knowledge of how to move a product, right? But you're seeing these these addictions or these hubs pop up in sort of extraordinarily unusual or smaller places like Louisville. You write about how it established, the meth world established there. Go into a little bit more detail about how that relationship was built and how it became such a problem there in Louisville.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. What I began to want to tell in the book was, I'm always interested in how drugs traffic. How do they move? Like car parts and sugar and genes, they move in certain ways. And so I began to look for stories that told how did this one drug come to this one region. One of the stories I found was Louisville. Louisville in 2000, what would have been 16, 15, 14, really didn't have much of a meth market. The drug was very expensive and it was not widely trafficked or widely dealt. But then two guys met. A guy named Wiley Greenhill in the prison system in Kentucky. They meet in the prison system. He meets up with a guy who's a guy named Pedro Nunez, whose father is connected to the Sinaloa cartel out in Riverside, California. They make this alliance, and these guys say Wiley Greenhill is a guy who had been dealing pain pills, Oxycontins and the like, and he sees this as a new market. They all see this as a potential boon for both because he's got the connections, the local connections, and they've got the dope. And so they begin to move, hundreds and hundreds of kilos of this stuff, pounds, I guess, of this stuff from Riverside, from the border through Riverside out to Louisville, and pretty soon Wiley Greenhill buys a used car lot to kind of hide what he's doing, and then he gets the word out every time there's a big shipment. All the dealers start coming through. It's like a go through, a drive through for meth. All these guys come in, they get their 5 pounds. You get your 10. Here's your 3 for you, and you're moving on and you're selling. And this establishes the market regionally. So Louisville, but also up into southern Indiana and some nearby counties. All of a sudden, you get a new market that these guys establish. They get arrested, they get busted, but by then, the market is clearly established. Everyone knows it, and there's all kinds of meth pouring in. And now, the last I spoke with folks out there, the dealers had to compete, and the way they compete is by delivering it to your house, or some of them were selling already loaded syringes loaded with liquid form of the drug, so you could immediately shoot up, that kind of thing. But what I found was that it's just a fascinating idea of establishing who in this one region does this. And if you multiply that, this is the way the underworld works. These casual encounters I've found so often lead to drugs, lead to these things happening. And it's only a question of, can you figure out which casual encounter it was and how it all worked? And in Louisville's case, I think the authorities definitely figured this out and made for a very interesting case study.
Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking to Sam Quinones, the author of The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. We've covered so much, and I have so many questions, but again, we've had this Q&A chat open here, this window open. We would love your questions. We know for those of us that are joining us, you guys have questions. I'm sure you came prepared, so type those in as I continue to pepper our author here with my questions. I guess my next question is, in terms of your own safety, how do you go about reporting on this? Do you usually travel alone? Have you ever, you've covered gangs and drugs and, turf battles and turf wars from Los Angeles to Mexico and in between. How do you go about where do you start? If you're a young journalist watching you and looking up to Sam Quinones, where do you even start to go about this, and how do you continue it? First
of all, my first contacts are usually law enforcement, prosecutors, cops. They are the ones who see this and have made cases. Usually, the ones I like are the ones who have made cases that will illustrate something along those lines. For example, the Louisville case, right? Yeah. But many others, and they were the ones I first learned about the Jalisco boys in Dreamland who were selling heroin like pizza. Right. And however, I learned long ago that if you just stick with law enforcement, you're really going to miss. They can be very, very good. But if you just stick with law enforcement, you're going to miss some very important elements to this story. And that's the personal tale of the people who are trafficking it, because these are people and they all have stories, and the stories can actually be extraordinarily interesting. I did this also with my reporting on street gangs in Los Angeles back when I was at the LA Times. And where I go, given that I'm not interested in being killed or kidnapped or all the rest.
You want to write another book, Sam, and we want to read it, right? We want you to stick around.
Yeah. Well, I find that the best way is going to prisons and jails. They are where all these people are who can tell you these stories. Now, so I spent a lot of time, and I did for this book, I did it for Dreamland, I did it for my stories about the Los Angeles gang world, contacting people in jail or in prison, mostly in prison, because in prison, their case is finished. So there's no doubt that they're going to spend the next 10 years in prison. What's more, a guy in prison, I have found frequently, he's a little bit more thoughtful. I found this to be true, particularly a little bit older they get, the more thoughtful about their lives, like, what the hell am I doing? You know, that kind of thing. There's a thoughtfulness that you don't find on the street among anybody, but certainly not among young guys. It's impossible to really interview people like that. It feels to me, it's not worth the effort. Let's put that, it's extraordinary effort for a little payoff. I find that reaching out to people in prison, you can find all kinds of stuff. I mean, really remarkable stories. But you have to do it a lot. And so in this book, there are 4 people whom I interviewed in prison. I also contacted some sources through contacts that I can't really talk about, who put me in touch with people who know quite a bit about the Sinaloa meth world, very, very credible sources. But that's can be a rarity, honestly. It's more likely the people who you find in jail and in prison. They're safe, you know where they are. You could have some time to kind of prepare to get out there. And as I say, a lot of them have thought about their lives. Like, what have I done? Why am I here? And here's the other thing. It's very important to understand this. Young journalists might want to know this too, is that everybody wants to tell their story. Everybody. Now, some people can't do it safely. And so, you know, when I write letters, I write lots of letters to people. Sometimes it's like, 10% get back to me. But because I don't come with a big camera, because I don't come with a big microphone, I'm just me and maybe a yellow pad. People, I think, feel more security in that. But I do believe in, and sometimes it's, I'm just doing these interviews in 15-minute phone calls from the prison, interrupted every 3 minutes by, this is a prison phone call. It's now being recorded. La da da. This happens all the time. Whatever I need from the people, I can get. A lot of these guys that I talked to on this last book were over the phone. And if you find someone willing to talk to you, this phone calling can go on for weeks and months, and that's fantastic.
It's really interesting because the addict, it seems, can be anyone from, a high school football star to, potentially an actor, a famous actor or something like that.
Sure.
In your conversations with those who are, as you say, are thoughtful, are reflected on their life about why they've gotten into this. Do you see any intersection or any commonality between those that are trafficking? Because we hear a lot about the addict story or the somebody who's going through recovery. Yeah. We rarely hear from the other side, the quote unquote bad guys, right? I mean, what do you learn? What have you learned?
I've heard a lot of different stories from these guys. I think a lot of them, they grow up in Mexican poverty, and Mexican poverty seems to me to be different than American poverty. It's both are about not having enough money, relatively speaking, of course. In Mexico, poverty is far more extreme. But there's also something to Mexican poverty that I think propels people on. And that is that humiliation. It's not just that you're poor. In Mexico, there seems to be very commonly you're humiliated because you are poor by people who aren't much better off than you are, but they're just a few rungs up the ladder, so to speak, economically. And this humiliation, I wrote an entire book about this as it pertains to immigration. My second book, Antonio's Gun and Delfino's Dream, it's on Amazon and all that. is a book about largely about how people migrate to get away from this humiliation and to then return to show other people how well they did. It's like going to a high school reunion, you know, really well off, all that kind of stuff. Well, the same is true of Mexican trafficking, except for the risk is much greater and the reward, of course, is much greater. You know, one time I was in South Central LA and I was at a liquor store and I'm kicking myself I didn't buy this t-shirt, but atop on the wall in the liquor store was a t-shirt that said in Spanish, "La vida recia, porque cuando eres pobre te humillan." And that means the fast life, the drug life, because when you're poor, they humiliate you. Now, I'd already written a book about that, but it just hit home so well. It was like, yeah, this is why. And so people who get into the trafficking world are motivated by a lot of things, a lot of economic issues. Could be want to buy land, want to rise enough to convince some girl to marry him, want to buy a new truck, want to start a new business, all these kinds of things. But a lot of times I've found that it's to avoid being the humiliated one, to have your own stories and not sit around the plaza, listen to all these guys talk about all their exploits, you know, and the gringas and all that stuff. You want to have your own story. It's a remarkable thing. It gets away from the purely economic motive that is certainly part of it. And it gets into a whole lot more about the psychology and the class system. The guys who were selling heroin that I wrote about in Dreamland, my first book on this topic. I mean, those guys, you know, all of a sudden they come back home and they're buying beer in the plaza for everybody. You know, they become the focus of attention. All the girls want to talk to them, and all the guys around them are green with envy. And this one guy told me, I remember the first fella in my town, my little village, who went north to sell heroin like this. He comes home, builds a house really quickly. Doesn't take 10 years like he does if you're a drywall hanger in the United States, sending your money back. This happens in a year or so. And the most amazing thing, what stunned us all, was he put an automatic garage door on his house. And so all the older folks in the town, this guy told me, would line up in front of his friend's house and just watch the door go up and down. It was, and he said, as soon as I saw that, I knew I had to go. I was never going to get, you know, girls were not going to marry me. I was never going to get what I wanted doing the kind of work that it's illegal here. I needed to do this.
Wow, that's so interesting to hear those personal stories, man. I mean,
that's why you go to jails. All the Mexican guys that I interviewed for Dreamland, all were in American prisons. There's 10, I can't remember now anymore how many there were. I'd say 8 to 12 of them. And some of them very, very quickly, not very substantially. Several others were really great interviews, and they told me what I needed to know.
Sam, you talk about your first book, Dreamland, and now we fast forward years later, you know, to this book, The Least of Us. Where does the drug trade go from here? You're able to have this institutional knowledge and perspective. You know, you've literally written books about it, right? Where do you see this new synthetic world of drugs going? How bad?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm reluctant to predict too much. I don't think reporters have a good track record, and it's kind of not the best idea for reporters to start predicting the future. I didn't predict fentanyl, I can tell you that. I mean, seriously, I'd be honest, very honest and open with people about that. I didn't understand that was going to happen. I will say, though, that there is now widespread knowledge around the world that they've seen how synthetic drugs can transform markets, and we're all already seeing new drugs come in, perhaps from China. It's unclear where they're coming from. As a matter of fact, they're not opioids, but they have a similar effect on the brain. And I'm not sure what I heard them called nitazene drugs. They're known as they all have the ending. There's isotonitazene, prototonitazene, metatonitazene. So we're seeing these show up in Chicago, in various places, Iowa, places like that, and they've killed hundreds of people. They're kind of dwarfed by the news about fentanyl and all that, of course. But you know what I suspect will happen is you will continue to see the world's traffickers mess around with drugs that are all of which are in the chemical literature somewhere. And so they're employing chemists who know how to read that stuff, know how to find that stuff, dig into it. And so I suspect that may be part of it, but I'm not sure that fentanyl is actually, the story is run its day yet. It's still, I think it may be with us for a while. I certainly think methamphetamine may be as well, until Mexico does something about the chemicals coming in and where they go and how they're used and all that stuff. And I would say one other thing about that until we as a country in the United States do something about the guns that are so easy to buy in this country and then are smuggled down to Mexico, that's where the impunity that they enjoy down there comes from the Mexican corrupt criminal justice system and the guns that come from us. It's almost as if we might as well be funneling guns to ISIS or something like that. So those guns are ensuring the impunity and the warring and the battles and all the rest that's going down, that's shredding parts of Mexico. And I think we as a country need to understand that that's part of the mix as well, and we need to do something about that.
And there's so much money being made here.
Yeah.
It's like a never-ending cycle, right? I mean, they say people, drugs come north, money, guns go south, right? I mean, it's just this constant cycle. One of the things I want to touch on before we wrap up this conversation, we have less than 10 minutes left here. And again, if you have questions for Sam, I've been taking up all this time here. I guess that's what I was selected to do here, to ask the questions. But again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box here. But you talk about the homelessness and how it's sort of hand in hand with use of methamphetamine.
Yes.
You talk about LA Skid Row and just these tent camps. Can you go into a little bit and describe a little bit more detail about how these two things are linked?
I think the tent encampments that we're seeing are there's a deep connection between that and this meth that's coming out of Mexico, largely because once people start using this meth, which is prevalent everywhere and dirt cheap. I was just speaking with this woman in New Mexico who was very graphic about how easy it was to find, and it's everywhere. And she said, every friend I have, literally every friend I have, has come to me through dope somehow. It's so hard to get rid of it, but you end up going a little or a lot mad. And it has very severe effects on your brain and that kind of thing. And one of the things that happens is you really can't be around other people. The last place you can really be is in a homeless shelter, because in a homeless shelter, you're surrounded by crazy people that you think, or you're surrounded by people, everybody's looking at you weird and you're just terrified of everybody. So a homeless shelter is out. So the tents have become almost like hand in glove with methamphetamine. They have a perfect lodging, if you like, for people whose main problem is a psychosis that's been induced by this methamphetamines coming out of Mexico in the last 8 or 10 years. It's a place, it's a little pod where you can be kind of all alone to yourself. You don't need to be around other people. And if you do, you want to be around people who can get you dope real easy. So the meth encampment, unlike the homeless shelter, is a place where that is very almost certainly the case. And so the tent encampments, homelessness is a very complicated thing. And there are as many stories about how people get homeless as there are people, I believe. It's a complicated story, and I really try to respect that. I would say, however, it does seem to me, my reporting has shown that that they go hand in glove, this meth coming out of Mexico and the mental degradation, mental illness, homelessness, and then the tent encampments are part of that as well. And particularly over the last six years, certainly in this town in New Mexico, which is clearly a town that has no problem with affordable housing of any kind. People are losing, this woman said, people are losing their houses because they just don't even pay the taxes anymore. They own the house outright, but they can't pay the city taxes or the state taxes because they're on meth. And so that's why they're homeless. And a lot of them end up, now that they've gotten the last 5 years, she said, these tent encampments that have popped up as the meth has turned.
We do have a couple of questions here. I missed these. I'm so sorry, guys. We got a couple of questions here for Sam. But the first from Sharon here, who asked, do you feel that there is more attention, this mass drug addiction epidemic, because it seems to be hitting more white Midwestern communities rather than large population urban areas where many people feel drugs are sometimes mistakenly associated with people of color and their cultures? Sam.
I would say that was more the case with the opioid epidemic, honestly. I would say too, that the reason, I mean, there has not been a lot of attention placed on this. I have to say, people think that it's gotten all this attention. I'm telling you, when I was a crime reporter early on, I covered the crack epidemic. The crack epidemic set the record for how much attention and media coverage, because it was so public. It was drive-by shootings, Bloods and Crips. I mean, it was just crazy. You could not live that way. And this has been a very quiet, generally been speaking, the opioid epidemic has been very quiet. Plus people, largely white middle class folks, have been very intent on not making it a big deal. It's not gotten a lot of attention because people wanted to hide the fact of how their son or daughter or spouse or uncle or grandfather got strung out and maybe he's on his third rehab and all that kind of stuff. It was only in the last few years, I would say, frankly speaking, since Dreamland came out, I think that's what I lived anyway, that the awareness really grew and you begin to see a lot more attention to it. But I would say 5 years for something that's been going on for 25 is not a lot of attention, honestly. And it's only recently, now I think the numbers are so scary, and the psychological effects on the cerebral effects on people are so scary that it's now grabbing the attention that it should have had a long time ago. But I guess maybe better late than never. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really sad when you talk about, you know, what we've discussed, this poisoning of our minds here in this, you know, in this society.
Yeah.
And the metaphor that you use, you know, I think somebody in your book talks about how, like, now the meth addicts, it's like an alcoholic. You could see there's a liquor store in every corner. There's meth, it seems, everywhere.
You know, it's about supply, right? This is about supply. This is supply creating new demand or enhancing new demand that was already there. That's what we've got going here right now. I think it's a very ominous thing because the supply is so relentless. Available. Because these chemicals, because there's so many people who know how to make this stuff down in Mexico. It's really a job. I think local communities can deal with this, but I do believe it's really now a job that the governments have to get together on and come to understand each other's needs but speak forthrightly to each other. They have in Mexico horrible corruption that is crippling that country. We have these guns that are allowing those guys to do this. And that are trickling south in small numbers, but relentlessly. And to me, that this is kind of, you want to talk about what needs to be done before anything else. It seemed to me that would be the place to be.
This leads us to our next question from Allegra, who wants to know: do you think that this problem will be eradicated one day?
You know, it depends what you mean by eradicated. Do I think that people will? Human beings will stop using mind-altering substances? I do not. There are ways, however, of mitigating the criminal effects, and this, you know, in treatment, in prevention. I would also say law enforcement has an enormous role to play. Remember the lesson of the Italian mob, which we did almost nothing about for 50 years. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, thought, you know, there is no such thing as the mafia. And meanwhile, the five families were becoming like corporations, and they were wheedling their way into waste management and gambling and construction and restaurants and on and on and on and on. And once you finally, and so they get to be part of the economy, adding something like, I don't know, remember the numbers, but 20 to 30% on the cost of construction in New York City, that kind of thing. It was just a horrible thing, all because we didn't do anything about it. What law enforcement did. And so all of a sudden, J. Edgar Hoover dies in the 70s. By the 80s, there's these RICO statutes, these anti-racketeering statutes, and all of a sudden you've got a new FBI, and they go after them. And the Italian mob is really a shadow of what it used to be in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that we allowed to fester and fester and fester. Law enforcement's role is that. You cannot just have Chapo Guzman's created. That's really bad for almost every institution in your country. And so law enforcement also has this role. There's a multifaceted, multidisciplinary role for everybody in this. But I think we're in a position now where people think, well, law enforcement, that's the drug war. They failed. No, law enforcement failed to the extent it failed, not because it was law enforcement we used, but because it was only law enforcement that we use. Just same way as we try to eradicate pain with one pill, one kind of pill, you know, same thing.
You know, as journalists, we know that not all stories have happy endings, but a couple of questions that we have here in the Q&A box is, you know, what is there to hope for here? I mean,
Well,
do you
we're
have?
getting into it towards the end of this this thing. It's actually half my book. We were talking about this stuff, the drug thing and all that, and it's very important to talk about because so little knowledge exists on it. Nobody's really aware of this. The meth thing is very, very important. All this stuff is extraordinarily important. But I would say that half of my book is about the drug stuff is about 40% of the book. The real half of it is about these stories that I set out to tell about people in small towns, small communities around the country, not who necessarily are looking to save the world. On the contrary, I think it's more like what I liked about these stories, what I looked for were stories of people doing small things, you know, at their neighborhood level, at their street level, in their church, whatever, to strengthen community in the smallest way. I think we are too enamored in this country, maybe in the entire world, maybe it's just natural, too enamored with the idea that we have one solution to change everything. And our magic idea, that is a narcotic, and it is very dangerous. I don't think it's very healthy for us to think those ways. I think the real innovation, the real change comes at the smallest level, the most local level, with unnoticed, unsexy kinds of movement stories about, and that's what I set out to tell. Americans doing the most unnoticed things in the service of repairing community, making their community better off. And that's why the title of the book is The Least of Us. It comes from my reading of the Bible, which I'm not a Christian, but I was reading the Bible during this, and I read the Gospel of Matthew. And, you know, where Jesus says to his disciples, "That what you do for the least of my brethren, you do for me." And I think that is, Jesus understood the very power of community. You know, we have in our grasp, in our brains, the most potent force that allowed us to survive these millennia, these millions of years. And that is community. This idea that not only it's nice to be around other people, it's necessary, it's essential. We don't survive without it. And we got away from that in this country in a very big way. We just shredded it. We decided we don't need to be with other people. We don't need to be, you know, I don't know, those people, they're messy. They get in my way. They give me a headache. You know, I don't like them. I don't believe the way they do. And so we shredded all these ways in which we formed these defenses. And these drug problems are really symptoms of how thoroughly we have shredded the bulwark of community defense that is powerful beyond words and has allowed us to survive as a species. And that's why I named the book The Least of Us. It's an idea that we are only strong as the most vulnerable. We're only as strong as the least of us.
Well, you mentioned also in your book, Sam, that meth is a metaphor for the times that we're living in right now. We're a few minutes over here, your allotted time, but I finish every interview by asking sort of the same question. If there's anything I haven't asked you that you think is important to know, I've asked you a lot of things here. We've gotten a lot.
No, Nick, you've been great, man. I really appreciate you taking the time. The questions have been fantastic, and I so appreciate your time and all. The truth about the matter is that I could speak for this on this topic for several hours and bore the hell out of everybody. I think we've done what we need to. The book is The Least of Us. If you need to be in touch with me, I'm very easy to find on the internet, email and so on. Website samquinones.com and all that. But I appreciate your standing in here and doing this, and also the Gwinnett Library folks. Thank you so much for organizing all this.
Well, we're so grateful for your time, Sam, and I have to mention our mutual friend Beto Duran, who was very excited that I was talking to you today.
My man Beto is one of the great guys in LA, man. He's a terrific guy.
I mean, thank you again for taking the time for your hour here. You're a busy man, and thank you to the Gwinnett Library for giving me this opportunity. Again, I'm Nick Valencia, national correspondent with CNN, and this has been a discussion with author Sam Quinones on his new book, The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth.
Night all.